Hey guys, how's it going? Valk here. So we just had this really big dev note drop for the upcoming patch in 2 weeks from now. So there's going to be quite a few units being buffed once again for this rotation. The last time we had one of these patches, it was right before E7WC, and it was very minimally meta impactful, shall we say, just to not disturb the meta as E7WC is still proceeding. For this patch, we're seeing a little bit more of a dynamic change for quite a few, especially Bruiser or Turn 2 units. Now, I'm not quite sure I agree with this cast being buffed. I think there are a lot of other more interesting heroes that could use a buff to shine in this meta. But, you know, those would just be my opinions. I'm pretty sure Smilegate has goals of their own when they're lining up these buffs, and as well as, performance changes, QLL changes, and all that good stuff. But without further ado, let's just jump right into it. I'm going to talk about each of the things they changed, how that impacts the way the hero is played, and what I think its effect on the meta will be. So let's just go. First, we have Straze. So there's only two really big changes you need to know about him. Number one is that his S3 can no longer trigger a counterattack, which is huge. This makes it so that he is very hard to landmine as an AoE aggro / cleave unit. This way, you basically can't really be beating him with stuff like Rem or Archdemon Shadow. So he definitely has a lot of better matchups. They also made it easier for him to reach 100% penetration. This way, his builds are a lot easier to optimize. Wow! So, in short, he's going to be way better versus slower tank down players, especially for example, like a lot of Korean players will go Mediator Kawer plus Adventurer Ross plus Archdemon Shadow. So in that exact matchup, Straze is going to be incredibly good, and he's going to be much better, even though he's already very solid there. So we're going to see a resurgence, and in RTA, I think he goes from a third, fourth pick to maybe even a second pick if I'm being a little bit ambitious with my predictions. But definitely he's going to be a very solid third pick. Up next, we have Fire Ravi. I think this is definitely one more Alencia answer, which the meta definitely needs right now. So now she also starts the fight with 40 fighting spirit, meaning she only needs to counterattack one time before her turn to pop her S3 on the first turn. And speaking of her S3, she now has a 50% defense penetration added to her S3 and can now activate in one attack. Yeah, so Fire Ravi just got huge stonks. On top of all of that, her effectiveness gain will now scale up to 75, up from 50%. This means for units that have about 100% flat FRES, so for where I'm at, which is, you know, usually around rank 200 to 100 or so, this means units like Adventurer Ross, DN, will now be within very comfortable stun range for Fire Ravi should she be able to land a hit on them. I think we definitely need more Alencia counters in the meta. Right now, only Hwayoung really counters her, and Hwayoung is pre-banned quite a bit, which means Alencia runs very rampant in a lot of games, whether it's aggro, standard, or sometimes you even see her in cleave or even anti-cleave. Up next, we have Kayron, so we'll be getting another fire DPS moving slowly into the meta. Oh boy. Now, the AoE S1 can also proc on counterattacks. So this makes counter Kayron much more viable. Although I would still argue he is still not in a great spot because of how his S2 works. Speaking of his S2, it's also getting a buff now that he's going to be getting evasion when it is triggered. So this does two things for me, right? One, it dilutes the buff pool. I don't know what the buff order is going to be like, right? Usually, if you imagine a match, right? When you get a new buff, your buff falls into the bottom left corner, right? It adds on to the buff. Those are the newer buffs. If something only strips one buff, it will strip the newer buff. So if something is supposed to hit him, trigger the immortality, and then strip, right? So quite a bit of attacks do that, right? It does the damage first and then strips. Now the evasion buff can protect the immortality, which I think is pretty neat. I think it's one of those things where it doesn't completely break the hero, but it definitely helps him. But it also does something else for him. Now, if this evasion buff doesn't get stripped, Kayron on Ervalin Artifact, Double-Edged to Crescent, which is something that got buffed last patch, now becomes a terror. And I'm not sure that's something I'm excited to face as an aggro player, but hopefully, you know, that's something I'm wrong about. But, you know, Kayron on counter with AoE counters on Ervalin Artifact seems very scary to me. Okay, up next we have Aria. This is one of those buffs where I don't really get it, but I'm going to be making some predictions. So overall, across the board, her damage dealt has been increased, which tells me Smilegate really wants to push this Bruiser Aria playstyle. Also, when it's not her turn, her effect chance to blind goes from 50% to 70, which, you know, it's pretty neat. I don't think it's super crazy or changes the game, right? Her S3 barriers increase, which I think is pretty, you know, depending on how much the increase is. I think if it can, you know, hold back a Designer Lilibet on a squishier unit and still not get popped, I think it's quite valuable. That's going to be my litmus test when she gets buffed. I'm going to be testing against Designer Lilibets. But if she can protect squishier units versus Designer Lilibet, I think it's going to be quite a strong buff. I think the number one thing in the meta, though, if I had to guess, is that Smilegate buffed her in anticipation of Alencia moving out of the meta a little bit. Because Alencia is the main thing shutting down Aria as a pick, right? Alencia is kind of in almost every game right now. So definitely, if Alencia gets pushed out with these Kayron buffs, with the Ravi buff, wow, like Aria is going to be making a comeback. And I think it justifies a little bit of effort being put into Aria for her to be a bruiser once again. Okay, now the Taeyu buffs do scare me a little bit, because within the skill has the text of dispel all buffs and ignore effect resistance in the same skill box. Now, whenever these two things are in the same skill, I start sweating, because I, as a very standard player for a very long time at RTA, one of the units I was scared of the most was Bazaar, and then Bazaar kind of got power crept by AOL, which got kind of power crept by Ran, right? So you have all of this dynamic of these heroes. Now, the thing that makes this okay is that he has to be enraged for this to activate. And on top of that, his base speed isn't like the most spectacular thing in the universe, so reasonably speaking, he's not going to be that strong. But he still does check all of these really fast support units, right? If you think about the Payra, the fast DNs we see nowadays. But the number one thing in RTA is that when you're playing against a real human players, they're not going to press their buttons, which means he's not going to be enraged, which means he does not gain the ignore effect resistance. So to me, it puts him on a similar tier to Celine, maybe a little bit worse, because Celine has built-in evasion and barrier. So Celine has a little bit better survivability overall. But what you can do with Taeyu is, if you play him in RTA, I imagine he would be able to be used in a draft where he can now counter Lionheart Sirmia. Because once Lionheart Sirmia casts It's Far From Over as a reaction to a dual attack or a counter attack, it's going to activate Taeyu's Enrage. And now you're going to be able to strip her defense buff and her res buff, regardless of how much effectiveness or you have or effect res your opponent has. And I think that's quite significant, because without defense buff, Lionheart Sirmia really ain't that scary. Now, what I wish this could have done was it also makes him element neutral, because that would make him a really good standard answer to Senya, which I think is what the game needs right now. The game needs standard answers to Senya, and the game needs standard answers to Archdemon Shadow, like multiple, right? And I think that's kind of what the game is still missing a little bit. Now, with Ravi and Kayron buffed, I do believe Senya kind of goes down in power a little bit in standard play, but Archdemon Shadow is still ever the presence, so I don't think Taeyu will see a whole lot of play, but in standard versus standard, I can see him being a tech pick, maybe versus Lionheart Sirmia. Up next, we have Roana. This one doesn't really do much. It gives a barrier on S3. We'll have to see the barrier numbers to determine how good it is, but The thing with Roana is you're never really picking her for her active skill, right? You're picking her for her passive, versus units like maybe Solitaria, Archdemon, Embellion, SSB, just name a few. So I really don't think it's significant. What I think the game need, as I said earlier, right, is more units that have good matchups or even okay matchup versus Archdemon. And we don't need to be making one of her better matchups even better. You know, we need wider buffs, not taller buffs, so to speak. If you're a card game player, you'll know what I mean. Now, Blaze Dingo gets a 75% chance to decrease defense for 2 turns. Defense Break is the best damage amplifier in the game, but this has 2 issues. So, with 75% proc chance, this can't really be used in aggro or cleave. Now, for a slower draft, Blaze Dingo has no built-in survivability mechanism, and his base stats are notoriously bad, right? He shares a base stat with DJ Bazaar, if I'm not mistaken, and these units are known to be the squishiest Soul Weavers almost in class, right? I think they're the second squishiest constellation for Soul Weavers. So he's definitely not a unit you could play in a longer match as well. So I don't think he's going to be played in PvP, but I do think he'll be able to be played in maybe Labyrinth and you know, Raid, Hell Raid, and those type of content, which is where I used to use him when I first picked him up as a hero. And I think maybe for a future Avon side story he could be useful, but even then, if you're doing Epic Hell mode, you definitely want a more reliable unit. Up next we have Kiwana. I think the changes made it so that she went from a more of a mono fire support to a support that only really affects fire units, which is generally better, but still not great. Her base speed is pretty good, so I think if you really do want to use her, she's a usable unit because she can strip buffs and stun off of S3. Her S2 gives, you know, attack up and skill nullifier, which is good utility, but for cleave and for aggro, she doesn't really manipulate CR in any way, which is kind of an issue. I think in the meta, there's easier and better to use supports that are either comparable or just a straight up upgrade to Kiwana. But what I do think this does is give new players with very limited options an easy choice, since she's quite okay for what newer players are going to be looking for. Okay, Hassal is seeing quite a bit of changes. Now she can stack fixed damage and heal herself on counterattacks. So being a knight, you know, who have access to Elber's Ritual Sword, I think this opens up a lot of paths for her to be played. Her passive also reduces counterattack damage and gives her a little bit of CR. Overall, though, I do think she lacks a lot of utility compared to something like a Pilus, which is a direct comparison. That unit is also a Dark ML 3-star, which is going to be the same rarity, but Pilus you can specialty change upgrade to be just a little bit more useful with the defense buff and the chain provokes. So I think I would still prefer Pilus over Hassal if I had to choose one. So in my mind, Pilus is way better than Hassal. But if Hassal ever gets a specialty change, it puts her either on the same level or slightly better than Pilus. Now, as for the artifact change of this batch, we have 2. First one up, we have Magic for Friends. I wouldn't really consider this one a straight up buff, mostly just because you reduce 5% more of crit damage, which is nice. I guess you call that a buff, right? But the most important thing is that now you can no longer kill a Mercedes, see that Magic for Friends proc, and be like, ha, just burned your proc. So now Magic for Friends cannot activate upon death, which is really, really nice, but I don't consider this a buff. They probably should have, you know, buffed another real artifact. So that's going to be this. Unfading Memories, though, I think is a really, really nice change. So the biggest problem with Unfading Memories when it first came out was for the longest time, and this is something I tested personally, is that you need to be full healing on 3 units to match the value of a Rod of Amaryllis. The good thing about Rod of Amaryllis is that it's always going to be healing a unit that needs the healing, no matter what, because it heals your lowest HP percentage ally. Now, Unfading Memories, a lot of times, if one of your units is getting just run down, it doesn't provide enough healing. Now that all healing for Unfading Memories is bumped up about 20% across the board, if you're healing 2 units, you'll be almost making up the value of a Rod of Amaryllis. On top of that, it gives you 25 gear score of effect resistance for free, which I think is massive because it gives 67% more than Guardian Ice Crystal, which is widely considered to be the best Soul Weaver artifact. I do think healing-wise, it's still a little bit weaker compared to Rod or Guardian Ice Crystal, but the extra res makes it very easy for fast DM builds nowadays to compensate for the F-res they're going to be missing, which, you know, is a very common thing we see at higher ranks. You would push these DNs to insanely high speed, but they're very easy to crowd control just due to missing a lot of effect resist compared to a slower Soul Weaver build. And the cool thing with Unfading Memories now is that at a base copy, you're going to be able to increase your effect res by 25%, and at plus 15, it's going to be healing 7.5%, which is basically the maxed out old value, which, hey, that's great value. So if you don't already have a copy of this artifact and you got some spare powder lying around, this artifact, as of recording, is still in shop, and it's going to be in shop for about 5 more days, and I would definitely pick that up to replace Rod of Amaryllis. So with that being said, that is actually this patch. I know it's not huge. There are a few really exciting buffs in here, particularly for me. I'm really excited about playing with the new Straze, new Ravi, new Kayron. I think Taeyu has some potential, so I might test him around a bit with the Grace of Growth feature. But for now, though, that's going to be it from me for today. Thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave me a like and maybe a subscribe if you want to see future videos similar to this one. I really appreciate it. It's free and it supports the channel a lot. If you think I missed something from this patch note, or you think you have a take that I might be surprised by, feel free to drop in the comments. I love to chat with you guys. For now, though, that'll be the video from me for today. The tank down draft guide for RTA will be coming up soon-ish. My editor just moved very recently. I'm not going to be bothering him about it. He's ready when he's ready. But for now, though, thank you guys for joining me today. I'll be seeing you guys in the next video. And yeah, hope you guys have a great rest of your day or night, wherever you guys are. And I'll see you guys next time. See ya.